I guess, first of all, we've just had a 2022 federal budget. So I'd love to get your take on it. Are we in for an era of free spending, or are we in for an era of fiscal restraint? How do you see things moving?
Yeah, we might be somewhere in between right now, Tony. I think there was an expectation that there was going to be a fairly large spending budget. I think it turned out to be a little bit more measured and modest than I think what a lot of us were expecting, particularly after the NDP and the Liberals came to a coalition type agreement for the next few years.
Yeah, so from your perspective, what were the big spending items in it, and what did you see that wasn't in it?
Yeah, so I mean, modest in terms of just comparison with past budgets. So like just in terms of some of these big numbers, Tony, like over the next 5, 6 years, the government was really on a net spending basis, really talking about spending something in the order of $30 billion. And that kind of spending was really, that's not a lot of spending when you think about, the government spends over $400 billion every year. And we're a $2.6 trillion economy. So modest in that sense. And I think modest in terms of the way they allocated the money across, a handful of priorities, including national defense, including growth, which was a bit of a surprise. A lot of us were wondering whether this government was really going to talk about growth and what the government could do to stimulate growth. Some more monies for Indigenous people, for healthcare, and housing. So, just overall, relatively modest spending measures spread out amongst a number of different priorities.
Gotcha. What do you see from this as the long-term implications for fiscal policy?
Yeah, I think the government realizes that we're at a pivot point now. And I think the planning assumptions for this budget were done early. So there was really done in pre Russia Ukraine war. There were the survey with the private sector, which you're familiar with, Tony, took place probably in a January timeframe. So really didn't capture some of what people are worried about now, what some of the economic consequences of Ukraine could be. So I think like the government was a bit careful not to come out in an inflationary environment with really too much more deficit financing of really consumption style programs. So I think really long term, it's still a bit of a question mark. Like where will the government go come in the fall? I think it will depend in part how the world economy kind of unfolds over the next number of months.
Do you think that it did then, as a budget, kind of frame the inflationary risks appropriately?
Well, I think I think it's mindful that there are inflation risks. Like we saw an increase in terms of the planning assumption and the inflation rate. I think they're probably underestimated what the consumer price rate of inflation will be in terms of a planning assumption for 2022. They came in around 4%. The Bank of Canada was sitting at around 5%. So interest rates, those sorts of numbers as well, we might be underestimating in terms of that planning environment. I think more conceptually though, the government is really kind of assuming that Canada, for the most part, at least the first round effects of the Ukraine-Russia war, will be a positive terms of trade effect for Canada. We'll see export prices rise relative to import prices. A lot of our oil producers, some of our metals, even some of our agriculture products will benefit by these higher prices. So the first, the first economic effect is pretty positive. The more dangerous sort of secondary effect, though, is the effect on real personal disposable incomes.
Right.
People are about to get squeezed with inflation running above 6%, with wages in that kind of 3% growth range, and with interest rates kind of going up. I think it's that longer term squeeze. I think that the government is worried about how is this going to play out over the next year or two. Are we headed for something like that some people would call a stagflationary type of environment?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that the storm clouds are gathering, and you're seeing all of these indicators of inflation rate that is surprising in its resiliency, perhaps. Like we all knew that post-pandemic there might be a bump in prices, but this is looking like a longer-term trend. We're going to continue with this discussion, though. I think there's a lot more to unpack here with our guest, Kevin Page. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these short messages.